Good afternoon, everybody. This is a live meteorological breakdown of a very tragic event that happened about 7 years ago. This is the El Reno, Oklahoma tornado breakdown from May 31st, 2013. And this is known as the largest tornado in history with a diameter of 2.6 miles wide. And I've got a lot of information here, a lot of radar loops, some video from our storm chase. There you can see the wedge there as visible from the Dominator. We had two Dominators out in the field chasing this storm west of Oklahoma City. It was a very large tornado, 2.6 miles wide. It touched down as a classic multiple vortex tornado, and it developed as such with very violent upward motion as visible in those subvortices. And those subvortices were even larger than many regular parent tornadoes themselves. Some of those subvortices were even larger than a quarter mile wide at times. And that's where those strongest wind speeds were measured. There were two mobile radars out in the field, the Doppler on wheels, the Raxpola unit was also out there, and they the latter mobile radar unit measured winds of 295 miles an hour. That would normally be an EF5 tornado that was measured in those large subvortices that were rotating around that tornado in Canadian County. Thankfully, though, those very violent subvortices did not impact any structures on the ground, so that's why this tornado was not given an EF5 rating, even though everybody knows that it was an EF5 tornado. And here is that the radar loop. This is from Radar Omega, and there you can see the velocity image as that tornado was turning to the southeast and then to the due east, and then it did a distinctive left-hand turn and then crossing I-40 there, lifting out to the north. This right here at this time is after the tornado. You can see that outflow boundary surging off to the south. There was quite a bit of flooding too. And here you can see an initial tornadic storm that developed right along I-40. That had a wall cloud. It produced a brief tornado, and then another updraft developed just to the south of that, quickly became a supercell. That produced a tornado just to the south of I-40, and that tornado went off to the southeast, and then it was initially moving at about 20 to 25 miles an hour, and then that tornado made a due east turn, passed just to the south of the El Reno airport, expanded in size, accelerated as well up to between about 35 to 40 miles an hour, and then it did that classic left-hand turn. It did a hard left-hand turn after crossing Highway 81, and then it was approaching Interstate 40 up there. That was when it accelerated, intensified, lifting off to the north, crossing I-40 up there, and then slowed down, and then did a little loop just to the north of I-40 as it went through the occlusion process there. Here you can see that updraft developing on the southern flank and then quickly wrapping up. Look at that curly Q turning off to the north as well. And many times tornadoes will do that, where they'll do a left-hand turn as they go through occlusion. We saw that with a very violent tornado that impacted the Greensburg, Kansas area back in 2007. And that was on May 4, 2007. That tornado also did a distinctive left-hand turn as it was accelerating and intensifying. So the tornado was very mature, and as it was roping out and doing that left-hand turn, still very violent, almost doing a slingshot effect. Many times those tornadoes will develop right near the apex of the RFD, kind of on the southeast side of that mesocyclone, and then as they mature and become occluded, they become more oriented more toward the centroid of that mesocyclone, if not on the eastern side, and that caused them to slingshot around that eastern side of the mesocyclone, and that's exactly what happened with the El Reno tornado, accelerating up to 50 miles an hour, expanding off to the east. And many times in spotter training courses, and it was generally known that if you stay southeast of the tornado, you should be in the safest spot. But that's why I've always said that it's almost safer to do a hook slice maneuver, approaching from the backside of that tornado, allowing the tornado to continue to move away from you. And that way, if your vehicle gets disabled or if you happen to stop, even just putting the vehicle in park is considered an escape route if you're doing a hook slice maneuver, because that tornado will move off to the east. And that's why I usually like to approach tornadoes from the up shear side, and then you can also look off to the north, and very rarely do those tornadoes like to expand up shear unless you're really getting one of those stationary ones like the Bennington tornado, for example, that we saw about 3 days before this on May 28th in north central Kansas. So now let's look at the 300 millibar map We'll start with the upper levels of the atmosphere, and then I'll break down our video a little bit and show you the different phases of the tornado as observed by the Dominator. So this is the 300 millibar map, and interestingly, the El Reno area was located near the base of that trough, not ahead of that trough as you'd usually expect with those big severe weather events. El Reno, located right here in Oklahoma, is pretty close to the base of the trough. The core of that upper level storm system was up over the upper Midwest, over eastern South Dakota into southwestern west central Minnesota. So usually you would target out ahead of this storm system. This is where you'd expect the strongest wind shear to reside. However, in this case, and as happened in many of the setups across during the end of May in 2013, there was a lot of instability, a lot of deep moisture off to the south of this trough. There was some overnight convection that lifted off to the north toward western Missouri, and then that sent out an outflow boundary that became draped across central Oklahoma. There was a lot of destabilization and modification of that outflow boundary, a development of strong instability along and just to the north of the outflow boundary, and you could see a lot of veered, almost due westerly, pretty strong winds aloft too. The core of that upper level jet was off to the north of the target area, so really the southern fringe of that stronger upper flow where you had the deep moisture, the strong instability, and then you had an overnight complex of storms that passed through the target area, lifted off to the northeast into central Missouri, and that left behind an outflow boundary that was able to heat up and cause those surface winds to either weaken or become weak out of the easterly direction. That enhanced that directional shear, and we're going to break down the photographs as well and the low-level jet during this setup. And I'm sorry if things are running a little bit slow or just a little bit choppy. That's because I've got a lot of things that are running right now. I've got a lot of maps to show you as well as a lot of videos. And here is our video of the El Reno tornado, and again it is running just a little bit slow. We had both Dominators in the field. There you could see Seth, our programmer from TVN, that was in the back seat. And this right here is when the El Reno tornado first touched down. You could see a very large tornado cyclone above, sub-vortices already. Even upon initiation of this tornado, it was already a multiple vortex tornado, many of those sub-vortices becoming very large right out of the gate. And anytime you see this very rapid upward motion and subvortices developing, you know that you've got a very strong vacuum cleaner or mesocyclone or above it that is causing this vortex to intensify and stretch. And this storm had a very strong mesocyclone above it. That led to the development of a strong tornado cyclone beneath it. And within that large tornado cyclone circulation, you had many of these multiple vortices developing. Right here, you're only seeing the condensation. You're seeing basically the cloud matter that's developing as you get those intense pressure falls. The air can more easily condense at lower pressure than it can at higher pressure, and that's why you can almost visualize the pressure field when you see the condensation happening here. So you've got very low pressure developing in the vicinity of that subvortex. It can't maintain force balance, so it splits into more subvortices as well. So really what happens is the pressure fall drops in those subvortices, and then the wind, which is in cyclostrophic balance for a short time, that's the balance between the pressure gradient inside the vortex and also the centripetal acceleration, the centrifugal force directed outward. When those are in balance, that's called cyclostrophic balance. But when that low pressure intensifies in the middle of that vortex, it causes the flow to go cross isobaric, and it goes in toward that low pressure as the atmosphere is trying to achieve equilibrium. And when you get that cross isobaric flow with the vacuum cleaner above it stretching, that's when they split into even more multiple vortices. And that's what happened here very early on. You knew this was going to be a unique monster type tornado because it developed right out of the gate as one of those large multiple vortex tornadoes early on in its life cycle. That circulation expanded dramatically as it went off to the southeast and then eventually made that right-hand turn and then the turn off to the north as that storm system occluded. So here's the general radar loop that you could see in the bottom right-hand portion of the screen. And I think that it should get a little bit easier to show these videos. I'm going to delete a couple of these just to hopefully help this thing run a little bit faster. So this is a very general loop that I wanted to show you first. And you can see early on, see that complex of storms up there in western Missouri? That sent out an outflow boundary ahead of the cold front. That outflow boundary was the focus for late afternoon initiation of storms. The first El Reno tornado touched down just after 6 o'clock p.m. Central Daylight Time at about 6:05 p.m. That was just after the first tornado warning was issued for that northern supercell right near I-40, and then a new updraft developed just on its southern flank, and then that one became the parent supercell that eventually resulted in the very large El Reno tornado that expanded up and over 2.6 miles wide. And it was all made possible by that overnight complex of storms that lifted off to the northeast into west central Missouri. There you can see it. That sent out an outflow boundary and left an outflow boundary behind that became situated near and just to the south of the I-40 corridor. And that modified as well. There was a lot of heating around that outflow boundary along and just on the north side of it. And there you can see a zoom in of that radar loop, the general radar loop. So notice that complex of storms in western Missouri up there. As I mentioned, that sent out an outflow boundary. You already had instability, extreme instability with capes in excess of 5,000. And even without that outflow boundary, you're talking about 100 to 150, 0 to 1 kilometer storm relative helicity. And when you weaken those surface winds and even make those a little bit easterly, it dramatically enhanced that storm relative helicity. So you kind of had the mesoscale meeting up with the synoptic scale conditions with a lot of potential in the atmosphere in terms of instability and wind shear. And then that came together to produce a very dangerous event. Again, here is that loop from radar Omega that I can show you. That was the initial storm right along I-40 that was tornado warned, and then that updraft developed right on its southern flank, impeded its inflow. That one became dominant, and there you could see that slingshot effect with the tornado as it turned to the due east and then off to the due north, crossing I-40, and then meandering, doing a little bit of a loop as the occlusion process completed just to the north of I-40 to the northeast of the I-81 intersection. Here is that storm relative velocity. See that initial tornado warning right there along I-40, and then you've got the new updraft developing. Bam, that's when that mesocyclone really intensified. And look at that lift off to the north, almost like a slingshot effect on the eastern side of that mesocyclone. The tornado intensified, expanded, lifted off to the north, expanding up over 2.6 miles wide, going at 50 miles an hour when it did that turn. And imagine the cyclonic vorticity generation too. In the inflow area of that tornado as it's turning left as the parent supercell is trying to continue to move off to the southeast. And then look at all that rain slamming into the Oklahoma City area. I was streaming live for Channel 4 out there, and I was trying to report that flooding that was several feet deep in areas, submerged vehicles on the west side of Oklahoma City. That was an extremely dangerous facet of this storm, as those storms were training over the same area and then slamming into Oklahoma City along that outflow boundary. Here are the Storm Prediction Center products. There was a moderate risk down central Oklahoma up into southwestern Missouri. That was along that outflow boundary left behind by the morning convection that I just showed you, lifted off into northeastern into southwestern Missouri. And this moderate risk out here issued by the Storm Prediction Center was along that outflow boundary from that convection that the morning at 12Z on the 31st was located over west central Missouri. That left behind an outflow boundary. Lot of instability too, a big blob of cape of about 5,000 interacting with that outflow boundary. And that outflow boundary underneath a 25 knot southwesterly 850 jet and a 35 knot southwesterly 700 flow only acted to enhance the storm relative helicity across central Oklahoma and including the I-40 corridor there. Now let's look at the tornado probs. 10% hatch area. That hatch area there, including the threat of strong tornadoes in the vicinity of that outflow boundary where it was still existing underneath very strong mid and upper level flow, southwesterly, low-level jet of about 25 knots. But really that outflow boundary settling into this area caused a general weak but large zone of easterly surface winds that acted to elongate those photographs. And we'll plot out those photographs here in a little bit. But first I want to break down the environment that these storms were nested within, and also summarize the timeline of that from the National Weather Service damage survey. The tornado touched down at about 6:03 p.m. Central Daylight Time. That was just northeast of Heston and Reuter roads. The initial speed was still relatively manageable from a chasing perspective at about 20 miles an hour. Initially, that storm motion was off to the southeast with that tornado, and it looked like it was heading straight for the El Reno airport when it made an easterly turn, missed the airport just to the south, and that was about 5 minutes after initiation. It accelerated to 35 to 40 miles an hour as it turned off to the east, passing just to the south of the El Reno airport as it was expanding and intensifying. At 6:19 p.m., the tornado crossed I-81 while doing a northward turn, accelerating to over 50 miles an hour as it was doing that northward turn, almost like a slingshot effect in the eastern side of that mesocyclone. Then between 6:24 and 6:26, the tornado reached maximum strength, and that was as it was doing that northward turn that was near Radio and Reuter roads, east of Highway 81 as it was approaching I-40. And then it made a loop just to the north of I-40 upon occlusion. And as the tornado was doing that northward turn, accelerating to 50 miles an hour, and it still had those subvortices, that's when the 295 mile per hour winds were measured very near the ground by mobile radar. Looking at the 500 millibar, you can see that the upper levels, that Vort Max was centered over eastern South Dakota, over the eastern Dakotas, the upper Midwest. As I mentioned, normally you'd want to target out ahead of this trough, near the core of the low-level jet. But in this case, you had overnight convection that moved into western Missouri. That left behind an outflow boundary, or OFB, and that can modify the low-level wind profile to enhance that directional shear, enhance the speed shear. You often get those big blobs of instability as well. And you've got a lot of cold air aloft. You can see the isotherms here. Minus 14, a nice blob of cold air coming around the backside of this system as well. But you're looking at 500 millibar temps still of minus 10 across northwestern Oklahoma, moving over the target area. And that's why you had 5,000 joules per kilogram CAPE. You had big time helicity as well. Here were the storm reports. You could see that cluster of just a few tornadoes in western Oklahoma. Perfect example of how it only takes one tornado to cause major problems. But you had that initial storm as well near I-40 that produced a quick, brief tornado. Then the updraft developed just on its southern flank, and that produced some additional tornadoes. You could see some more brief tornadoes here in far northeastern Oklahoma into southeastern Kansas in the vicinity of that outflow boundary. And then up here as well, west central Illinois, just north of the St. Louis area. That would be where you'd normally target synoptically if you would completely ignore an outflow boundary with the instability, modification of the low-level wind field with that outflow boundary. You normally want to target just ahead of the trough where you have a stronger low-level jet. Even probably some pseudo-cold core tornadoes here across far northern Iowa as well. Here is the Norman sounding. And this is the observed sounding at 0Z, just about an hour after the El Reno tornado first touched down. You can see the hodograph up there at the upper right. Textbook hodograph. And the outflow boundary made it possible to have all these easterly winds up here at the low levels, probably 500 meters up to, I'd say this is probably a kilometer, but you can see below a kilometer, you had a lot of these easterly low-level winds happening there all the way up, and that was made possible by that outflow boundary. That led to a lot of directional shear, southeasterly low-level winds from the surface to just above the ground, flipping around to southwesterly, and you had a bit of a max too at 700 millibars. And one thing I noticed in breaking down this event is that the 0 to 1 kilometer storm relative helicity fields fixed to that lowest kilometer seem to underappreciate how strong the low-level shear really was across central and western Oklahoma available to this El Reno, Oklahoma storm. However, when I looked at the effective storm relative helicity, in which it had a deeper inflow layer, I noticed that it sampled a lot more of these low-level southeasterlies flipping around to southwesterly just above a kilometer. And when you factor that in, you really really represented well just how strong the low-level shear was in this observed sounding out of Oklahoma City, which was to the north of the outflow boundary. Plenty of destabilization. You can see a little bit of a cap, but the parcels easily overcome that. Quite a bit of dry air too in the mid-levels. Very robust elevated mix layer. We are missing some of the upper parts of this sounding, but you can see a lot of CAPE between that parcel lift and the environmental temperature, which is red. That's why you had 5,000 CAPE there. But look at this photograph. You have a storm motion here, due east at about 25 knots. Interaction with that mesocyclone and the occlusion of that tornado cyclone lifting up on the eastern side of that very intense mesocyclone caused those storm motions to even accelerate greater. It did accelerate up to about 40 miles an hour when it made that due easterly turn, which increased the rate of streamwise vorticity intake, helped to intensify and increase the size of that tornado. But whenever you get these easterlies out here at the low levels, and then you get some really strong mid and upper level winds, the stage is set to form those really large mesocyclones with large tornado cyclones underneath, the mesocyclone acting as the big vacuum cleaner above, and any eddy underneath that vacuum cleaner is a candidate to couple with the mesocyclone and become a big tornado. That coupling process in this case happened very rapidly as the storm was moving off to the southeast initially. And look at all of that storm relative helicity when you have a southeasterly moving storm. And then when that storm turned off to the east and accelerated up above 40 knots, that's when you had the maximum storm relative helicity available to that storm. You had a greater rate of streamwise vorticity intake as that easterly motion accelerated up to above 40 knots. You also had some very strong mid and upper level winds aloft that were continuing to drive that easterly storm motion. But definitely a textbook photograph for strong tornado potential. And we saw similar photographs like this during the Pilger twin tornado event, June 16, 2014, June 17, the Bennington, Kansas tornado, May 28, 2013, where you get those residual outflow boundaries, you get a backing of those low level winds. You still have a 40-knot southwesterly low-level jet at 1 kilometer, so you have a lot of potential shear if you can really get these weaker surface winds and those easterlies at the low levels to bring that photograph back to to this quadrant of the plot. That's really how you enhance the available wind shear for these storms. Now we're going to break down the RAP analysis to really drive home the points that we've hit so far. And as I mentioned, there was a big CAPE blob. We already saw it here on the sounding. Photograph was textbook as well. And the RAP analysis really shows that CAPE blob in full force, about 5,000 CAPE here. You had the outflow boundaries settling in along I-40 from those storms at 12Z over western Missouri, passing through Oklahoma in that target area overnight and lifting off to the northeast, making way for unimpeded surface heating along that outflow boundary. Major thermodynamic modification. So you really had 5,000 CAPE to the north of that outflow boundary with a little bit of moisture pooling as well. Some decoupling happening, some slightly weaker surface winds, more backed as well. And as I mentioned, the 0 to 1 kilometer fixed layer storm relative helicity really underdid the amount of low-level shear that was in place along this outflow boundary. This fixed lowest 1 kilometer wind shear did a great job at picking up the target area across west central Illinois into east central Missouri, where there were some tornadoes reported. Those were reported across west central Illinois into just north of the St. Louis area. Synoptically, this looked like a more favorable area for tornadoes. Out ahead of that upper trough, you'd expect the synoptic scale low-level jet to be stronger up here as well ahead of that trough. And really, if you just look at the 0 to 1 kilometer layers, if you didn't look at any observations and really did kind of a half-assed forecast, then you would target this area up here to the north of St. Louis into west central Illinois. But realizing that an outflow boundary sagged into this target area, caused those low-level winds to weaken, even back a bit below 1 kilometer, And the effective storm relative helicity really seemed to capture that much better, capture the true inflow layer of these storms. You could see a little bit greater low-level shear that was analyzed along that outflow boundary. And that's one thing I noticed, is that the effective helicity measures in the lowest layers seem to do a better job at capturing just how strong the wind shear is in the vicinity of these outflow boundaries left behind by overnight and morning convection. And the reason for that is when these outflow boundaries settle in, I believe that the lowest kilometer of the atmosphere is largely defined by those southeasterly or even weak easterly low-level winds near and just to the north of the outflow boundary. But then when you get above a kilometer, you start to capture that abrupt flip to the southwesterlies up towards 700. So really the effective low-level jet is located a little bit above the 1 kilometer layer in this case. Looking at the SIG-TOR parameters, composite indices that factor in instability and wind shear. These composite indices also seem to do a pretty good job at picking up these outflow boundary events. They pick up on the big helicity that's in place, and there is a lot of, they also pick up on the instability, the major cape that was left behind. So this index is, when you get cape in excess of 5,000 and even with modest low-level wind shear, these SIG-TOR values go up through the roof. And they do a very good job at picking up on the combination of those high instability events, marginal wind shear that are enhanced by an outflow boundary. So here you can see the target by the SIG-TOR parameter that also picks up on this target area that was more favored synoptically near the core of the low-level jet and out ahead of that trough just a bit more. And there were tornadoes up here to the north of St. Louis into west central Illinois. If you're just looking at the synoptics, you might only target this region. But if you dig deeper into the mesoscale, then you see that outflow boundary that sagged across I-40. And you can really see just how prime the atmosphere became along and just to the north of that outflow boundary. This is at 22Z. Another thing you can look at is just how the composite indices, or really any index, trends with time. And here you can see from 22Z to 23Z, you have, if anything, a maintenance or an increase in the SIG-TOR parameter as that low-level jet increased just a little bit. Cape held steady, and the trend was for that significant tornado parameter to increase. Looking at the Supercell composites, also very high across the target area. Usually for tornadoes, you really want to focus on the lowest layers of the atmosphere to look at that extreme low-level shear. But the Supercell parameters, the SIG-TOR parameters, do a very good job at picking up on the maximum tornado threat in the vicinity of these outflow boundaries where it may not be in the most prime area synoptically, but those ingredients come together at the last second. In this case, you had a mesoscale outflow boundary. You had synoptic scale conditions that made it possible for when the arrival of that outflow boundary weakened and backed those surface winds, it created for extreme conditions for very large tornadoes. Here's the 850 millibar analysis at 23Z when the tornado first touched down. You can see a 25 to 30 knot low-level jet there. So not an incredibly strong low-level jet. This wasn't one of those events that looked huge on a synoptic scale with a big warm sector and a potential for a super outbreak, or one of those high-risk type of situations where the variables and photographs look extreme over a very large area throughout the warm sector. In this case, you had about 25 knots at 850, which will still get you a tornado threat. Usually 850 winds, you need greater than about 20 knots to realize a robust tornado threat. In this case, though, 25 to 30, even without an outflow boundary, still could develop an isolated tornado threat, especially with the instability of about 5,000 joules per kilogram, major instability out there. That turned this from an isolated tornado threat to one with strong tornadoes once you develop those weaker surface winds, back those very low levels of the atmosphere, and really elongate that photograph. One thing I did notice with this setup, though, is that very strong winds at 700. You've got a 35 knot 700 millibar jet, which seemed to be a little bit stronger on the southern side too. You can see a bit of a trough here at the 700 millibar a layer in the thermodynamics at least. And so there was a bit of an enhancement at 700, a 30 to 35 knot southwesterly wind. And this shows you that when you have those weaker near calm or easterly winds at the low levels caused by the outflow boundary, and then you flip around to southwesterly above 1 kilometer, this type of a setup almost has some high plains characteristics, where most of those severe weather events are post-frontal with low-level easterlies through a deep, in excess of a kilometer layer. But this kind of also had characteristics of Tornado Alley. May 28, 2019, last year near Linwood, had similar characteristics like this, where you have an outflow boundary, but you still have decent instability, decent thermodynamics and kinematics on a synoptic scale to still get at least an isolated tornado threat. But then those slight modifications from the outflow boundary with all that instability really leads to a robust tornado potential to develop in the vicinity of that modified outflow boundary. Again, I wanted to show you that morning precipitation. This is at 12Z, showing you that complex of storms. And I believe that if this complex of storms did not come together overnight and lift well northeast of the target area, I suspect that the El Reno tornado would not have materialized as it did. There probably just would have been an isolated tornado threat in the warm sector. Most of the tornadoes that happened to the north of St. Louis and to western Illinois there. But this complex of storms, located just to the southeast of Kansas City the morning of May 21st, and leaving behind an outflow boundary that stretched all the way to the southwest into central Oklahoma, certainly modified the lower portions of that photograph to elongate and develop that strong tornado threat. Here was the morning summary. It did have the outflow boundary analyzed out ahead of that stationary front. The outflow boundary settled in here right along I-40. And was even the focus for some isolated tornado development near and just to the north of that outflow boundary across far northeastern Oklahoma to southeastern Kansas. But back to the southwest, where you had greater instability, 5,000 Cape, you had the outflow boundary. There was even the hint at a bit of a meso-low. When I look at that very general radar loop, you could see those storms trying to go a little bit due easterly. And then once the meso-low passed, everything dove off to the south. You can almost see the little wave or the little kink happen where those two supercells near I-40 developed ahead of that little pseudo-surface low. Evolved, produced a big tornado, occluded just to the north of I-40, and then bam, everything surged off to the southeast, dominated by outflow on the backside of that pseudo-surface low. And you can even see it analyzed on this map near the intersection of the dry line and that outflow boundary. And that little ripple or wave lifted up along that outflow boundary and may have acted to even enhance the low-level jet a bit more than what that observed photograph showed. Here was, this is a track from the National Weather Service that shows you the evolution of the El Reno tornado, that initial motion off to the southeast. This is where in the video you saw those multiple vortices lifting straight up into the already large tornado cyclone. Had a due southeasterly motion, extreme storm relative velocity as we saw in the photograph with that southeasterly motion at 20 knots. You really can't sustain that very long. Then you had a shift to the due east with that storm, the tornado accelerating up to 40 miles an hour. That increased the rate of streamwise vorticity intake, caused the tornado to increase in size even more, or at least maintain its intensity. And it did a couple little ripples up here. This is near where we lost our hood with the Dominator. So we were driving along, going west to east, I believe on Reno Road, just to the north of the tornado. We were looking off to the south and saw all these large subvortices spinning around inside, some of those getting even larger than a quarter mile at times. And then we ran into power lines right in the western part of that very large tornado cyclone. There were power lines that were blocking the road. We slammed into those. They became wrapped around the light bar that was on our hood. We tried to free ourselves from those power lines. Sean was driving. He put the car in reverse. And it was like stretching out a slingshot with the power lines on either side, sparking. You saw sparks going everywhere. And once that got so tight that the hood became loose. It shot it out like a frisbee. You saw the hood take off in the distance horizontally, and we never saw the hood hit the ground. It just kept launching off into the distance like a frisbee. We went back into the damage path the days later, and we could not even find the hood amongst the rubble. I'm not sure where it went. Probably ended up somewhere to the north of I-40 because there's a lot of surface area relative to its lower mass of the hood, the armored hood of the Dominator. The beautiful thing is that once we lost the hood and exposed the raw engine, that it definitely solved our overheating problem with Dominator 1. So we were just cruising along with the engine completely exposed and had no issues with overheating after that. Oops, I was just drawing on that map. It's drawn on the wrong map. But initially, at about 6:03, 6:04 p.m., that's where the tornado touched down, and we had that rapidly vertical motion, multiple vortices, large subvortices already upon a development. Usually a tornado will develop, mature, and then develop the multiple vortex stage a little bit later in its life cycle. But the El Reno tornado, came down as a multiple vortex tornado, moved off to the southeast. Extreme storm relative helicity with that southeasterly motion at 20 knots. That helped maintain that vortex. And then with the turn to the due east and an acceleration above 40 knots, that increased the rate of streamwise vorticity intake, while you still had some big time area between the hodograph and the storm motion curve there. And then as that tornado crossed I-81, it did the classic left-hand turn. And anytime you're chasing a big tornado, you've always got to be aware for the left-hand turn. I've seen it time and time again. It's just a part of the internal dynamics of the storm. Usually the tornado develops near the apex of the RFD, a little bit on the southeastern flank of the mesocyclone, and then as it matures and becomes more oriented in the centroid of the mesocyclone, or at least on the east central part, that's when they begin to lift off to the northeast. Sometimes the tornado will weaken along the north central part of the mesocyclone, and the remnants of that circulation will spin all the way out and around the backside of the hook of the storm. Some of those really slow-moving supercells with multiple tornadoes, they almost behave like a merry-go-round with old circulation spinning back up into the core, ejecting on the backside of the hook. New circulation develops in the apex of the RFD near the southeastern part of the mesocyclone, lifts on the east central part, back into the core, and then you just get that over and over again, going around in a circle. In this case, though, the tornado was so substantial on the southeastern side, increasing to 2.5, 2.6 miles wide. This is actually the second, or the widest tornado I've ever intercepted, but the second widest tornado was the Hallam, Nebraska tornado on May 22nd, 2004, southeastern Nebraska. Also gained visual of that one, and in fact we drove into that tornado after dark. All kinds of stalks, grass, little debris getting lofted in front of the vehicle. Thankfully we were okay on that one. But the Hallam, Nebraska tornado was known as the widest tornado in history for the longest time until El Reno happened. And again, just to ram it home when you're out there storm chasing, when you're doing a hook slice maneuver. So let's say this is a giant hook of that supercell storm right here. The tornado is probably in this area. The way that I choose to intercept storms is doing a hook slice maneuver, moving west to east through the hook of the storm. This right here being the hook. It's called a hook slice because you try to go through the hook and the driving northerlies, the driving rain and hail in the northerlies, and then once you emerge from that, then you see the tornado off to your southeast or even to your due east. And when you're executing that maneuver, you can always stop as an escape route. You can come to a complete halt and allow the tornado to evolve and move off to your northeast and do that left-hand turn. You can usually see the left-hand turn. When you're approaching from the west like this, when you're just on the west side of the vortex, you can even look up through the clear slot and see the back side of the vortex almost all the way up to clear sky. And that's usually the extent to which the tornado wants to expand, at least up shear. But they can expand more rapidly down shear, being in this area. And that's one thing that can make it a little bit dangerous if you're a spotter or chaser to the due east or to the southeast of that tornado, especially a storm that's moving to the southeast, and you know it's going to do that big turn to the due east and eventually to the left. But tornadoes like to expand more rapidly down shear. And a lot of times the tornado vortex is tilted with height. So if you're east or to the southeast of the tornado vortex likes to tilt with height downstream. You're going to see this in our paper that we released on the rocket launch last year, just how tilted that tornado vortex can be, especially above about 10,000 feet. And they like to expand very rapidly down shear. That's why I believe that the hook slice maneuver is the safest way to get close to tornadoes. The exception being when you have a more meridional storm motion, more due south to north oriented storm motion. Then if you do a hook slice and you emerge to the north of the tornado, you can find yourself in the path of it. When that happens, you'll emerge from the hook and then you'll be experiencing strong easterlies in the north side of that tornado, maybe even some northeasterlies flowing into that. And that could be some big problems. But then you just want to adjust your hook slice. When a south to north moving storm, the hook slice maneuver becomes this. That's what I did on Dodge City, May 24, 2016. And being aware of the storm motion, the appropriate angle of approach, all of that stuff kind of becomes instinctive when the longer that you storm chase. Eventually you'll just start to know all that stuff second nature, and those decisions, you don't even have to really think them through too much. And even when you're chasing at night, you can go by purely wind direction alone and ascertain where that tornado is located. So now I want to go back to the radar loop. We'll go back to the RENO video. And then I'll give you a step-by-step analysis of our video relative to the different phases of the tornado and what we've analyzed here so far. Let me pull this thing up here quick. Sorry for if this is a little bit of a buggy as live. So there it is when it first developed, as I mentioned. This is about 6:04 p.m. The big tornado cyclone above it. That's not a mesocyclone above it. The mesocyclone is much larger than that. The tornado cyclone is like a subvortex of a mesocyclone. But it's splitting into multiple vortices. This happens when the pressure fall at the lowest levels of the tornado is so dramatic that the wind doesn't have time to adjust. So it goes in toward the center of that low pressure, splits it into multiple vortices because you have a vacuum cleaner above it, stretching those eddies underneath. So when that low pressure beneath that tornado cyclone intensifies so rapidly, the surface winds are not in cyclostrophic balance. So there's not a balance between the low pressure in the middle of the tornado, the centrifugal force directed outward. It cuts in toward the center of the tornado, and that's when you get the merry-go-round effect of those multiple tornadoes coming around the side. Again, it's cross-isobaric flow that causes this, but a lot of turbulence, a lot of chaos at the low levels as you've got a really intense vacuum cleaner-like action above it. You get all kinds of eddies, turbulent eddies forming along the different boundaries at the apex of the RFD, where you get a lot of cyclonic vorticity generation. You can see it tries to plant a singular vortex, but it's unable to because the tornado vortex is already so strong. The pressure is so low underneath that tornado cyclone that the wind is forced across the isobars toward that low pressure. And with that vacuum cleaner above it, you get the development of intense subvortices on the scale within that of the large tornado cyclone above. You see the upward motion, even some reflection of gravity waves happening there. You can almost see the slingshot effect there on a smaller scale as those subvortices are lifting on the east side of the larger tornado cyclone. They develop on the southeast side of the tornado cyclone, lift rapidly on the east side, grow in intensity, increase their forward speed, and then they weaken on the north side of the tornado. You see that same thing happen with tornado cyclones within the mesocyclone. There you can see the Dominator 1. That was Dominator 2 there. But this tornado is moving southeast at this time. This was at about 6:06 p.m. Still moving southeast. I was streaming live on channel 4 at this time. We had it surrounded. This thing is definitely slow-mo. There we are looking as the vortex is heading in the direction of the airport. This is just after it developed, probably about 6:06 p.m. There you can see a baseball, softball on the ground. This is now as we're getting to Reno Road. We went due east on Reno Road, and the tornado turned off to the east, drastically increased in size. This is actually a sub-vortex you're looking at right there. The wedge is much larger. And then we're heading east on Reno Road. This is when the large tornado was off to our south. That's still a sub-vortex that you're looking at there that was in excess of a quarter-mile wide just off to the south. And we were going to move in for a hook slice intercept. We're on Reno Road, moving due east. Large tornado developing just to our south. And then we ran into those power lines. There, looking southeast, you can see one of those sub-vortices. And this is when the 295 mile per hour wind was measured in one of these very large sub-vortices that was ripping around the south and southeast part of the wedge. And then this is as the parent wedge was becoming fully condensed, just beginning to become fully condensed. Lots of debris flowing around it. But still, this is a large sub-vortex of a much larger wedge that was larger than about 2 miles wide. So with the Dominators, we were inside that large circulation in the north side. There's usually a little weak area. There you can see another one of those developing sub-vortices in the very south portion of the tornado cyclone. That thing will continue to intensify, slingshot around the southeastern and east side of that tornado vortex before it weakens on the north side where we're located right here. And we were about to run in to the power lines at this time in the north side of the tornado. And that's, you can see the green color in that clear slot. Right there was where we ran into those power lines. You can see Chris Whiteneck, our Storm Chasers camera guy, in the back seat too. He also shot tornado chasers, and then there's the hood getting removed. Looks like it just went straight into the ground there, but again, here is that radar. That's the initial storm that developed near I-40. This is on radar Omega. That one produced, and look at that updraft blow up on its southern flank. Quickly at an organized hook, rear flank downdraft, and bam, there was that left-hand turn along the east side of the meso. And then the storms kept training over the same area, producing quite a bit of flooding. So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed these. I'm going to take some questions here from Facebook supporters. These live meteorological breakdowns, live streams are all made possible by the Facebook supporter community. But I figured this is such a big case study that I include everybody on it. Yeah, this is also the very tragic day when our friends, Team Twistex, passed away. Tim Samaras, his son, Carl Young, all very sadly were impacted by this deadly tornado. And woke up the next morning hearing that news. Was one of the most tragic days that I can remember. There are some of the best storm researchers in history out there, some of the best storm chasers. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were always so concerned about our safety. But they're pioneers in the field of tornado research. Other storm scientists will pick up where they left off, including us, and we'll just continue to collect data inside these tornadoes and try to better understand them. But Tim Samaras had the world record measurement of a pressure fall inside of a tornado about 10 years before this, inside the Manchester, South Dakota tornado, June 24, 2003. He deployed one of his probes inside that tornado and measured a 100 millibar pressure drop. Jim Cantori was not with us, and I don't think he was out in the field for the El Reno day either. He wasn't out with us for Bennington, Cora, or the El Reno event, but he was out with us for May 17, May 19, and a couple of those bigger events earlier that year. Yeah, Sean is great, incredible driver, able to free us from the power line being down. That's true, Caleb. Friction does enhance the development of subvortices. So if you can imagine a vortex in cyclostrophic balance, the balance between the pressure gradient force inside, the centrifugal force directed outward, and then you slow those surface winds just a little bit, that throws it out of balance. That reduces the centrifugal force directed outward. That means that the pressure gradient force is stronger, and that causes the wind to turn in toward the center of the vortex and then develop into those multiple vortices. But it's also dependent on the relative strength of the tornado cyclone above, because that determines just how quickly the bottom drops out of that pressure fall at low levels. Yeah, if you do the hook slice maneuver, at least if your vehicle fails, if the wheel falls off or something, you can always stop and allow the tornado to move off to your east and eventually lift off to the northeast. Test. There's no sound. Can you guys hear me? I hope there is sound this whole time. Yeah, the weird thing is I wasn't as afraid of this tornado while we were chasing it as I was 3 days before with the Bennington, Kansas tornado. That one felt like an even stronger tornado to me, and it was because its storm motion was even that much more unpredictable. It was basically doing figure eights beneath a nearly stationary mesocyclone above, and we got separated from the dominator, tried to run like a quarter mile away to launch our shoulder-mounted air cannon into the tornado, and Sean and I nearly got in trouble as that tornado was approaching from the south. Winds increased to like 90 miles an hour, easterlies to the north of the tornado vortex. And we barely made it back to the dominators to retreat into the calm area just to the north of that vortex. But I was more intimidated of the Bennington, Kansas tornado on May 28, May 28, 2013, just a few days before this. But then the day after, realizing just how powerful and large this tornado was, we kind of looked back and were like, dang, it's a good thing we hit those power lines after all. Yeah, I did observe some ground scouring with this one too. Pretty shallow scouring, no, nothing huge. And I think that that's probably because they're the lack of very large debris. From chasing, in my opinion, what this has reinforced to get close to tornadoes is to really go for that hook slice maneuver instead of approaching the tornado from its path. I feel like that more rapid expansion down shear is a big deal, with tornadoes less likely to want to expand up shear into the wind shear. And so if you have a south to north moving storm approaching from the south and penetrating that hook is the safest way. When you have a west to east moving storm approaching from the west. But again, the road network isn't always favorable. I still think it's always best to approach from up shear. If a storm's moving southeast, northeast, west to east, south to north, you want to do more. You always want to approach up shear, even though you can't really see the tornado quite as much. Just going through the supporter questions from supporters here. I think that if you stay even a half mile to a mile due south of the storm, if it's moving off to the southeast, that is probably a safe area. It will give you enough time to adjust if it does do that southeastern turn and a rapid southeastern expansion. Still though, if you're anywhere up shear of the storm, you've got to be prepared for that rapid expansion. You can usually assess it based on the relative size of the circulation or the tornado cyclone too. Then you can always retreat. But when you're up close to these tornadoes, you really got to be doing a hook slice maneuver approach from the up shear area to do it safely. Evan, I would like to intercept again in the Dominators. I don't have one available to me on an everyday basis. Dominator 1 and 2 have so many miles on them they can barely drive. They're kept at tornado safe shelters in OKC. Dominator 3 is owned by Sean, and he's trapped up in Canada right now due to the coronavirus concerns. But I do get to chase in Dominator 3 when we get the whole team out there, get everybody together. I just drive a Subaru now. I could barely get my pants on in the morning, much less fix a vehicle. I can do these live updates though, which is good. So when the tornado hit I-40, it was basically finishing out the occlusion process. So the tornado developed on the southeastern side of the mesocyclone, right at the apex at RFD. And then as it matured, it moved around the south side. It continued off to the east. And then it got to the east side of the mesocyclone and slingshotted around the east side, accelerating off to the northeast. And then the mesocyclone continued, and then the tornado was on the north side of the mesocyclone. And that's usually when they weaken and start to rope out, almost stationary there as it still tried to hang on. And then it spun out. It's almost like an upper level storm system that becomes vertically stacked from the low levels all the way up. They spin down on each other and then weaken. But when the low level cyclone and the upper storm system are offset, that's when the system is still ramping up. The low level cyclone is still intensifying. And then when they become vertically stacked, it starts to fill in. Surface pressures begin to rise. The same thing happened on a smaller scale. In this case, though, you have the mesocyclone or the tornado cyclone developing within. It ramps up on the southeastern side of the mesocyclone, lifts up on the eastern flank, and then finally dies out. Elizabeth, I really don't fear anything when I'm intercepting a tornado. It's kind of my comfort zone. I feel like I have a deep understanding of what the storm's doing and what it's going to do. The one thing I fear most, probably human interaction, I would say I fear way more than any tornado intercepts. I do miss OU football. I always miss OU football, Jeremy. And Matt, really glad you're feeling better. I'm about to shoot you a personal video to help hopefully enhance your recovery process, but I was told what you've been going through the last few weeks. Really hope you feel better. In fact, I hope everybody feels better out there too. Stay healthy. Keep those immune systems boosted. I'm eating 10 eggs a day to try to keep my mitochondria functioning at a high level. Not sure if that does anything, but makes me feel decent. And Penelope, don't worry. The more I hammer these live briefings and live breakdowns, the more you'll understand it. Gizmo, I'm about to cut her hair here on my own. I haven't yet, so she's still pretty upset with me, but I'll be doing that here soon. She definitely runs the show here. And the models are starting to trend back a little bit toward next weekend, being potentially active in Dixie Alley, but overall, the models have definitely trended down this first half of April. So it's possibly that this storm season could really ramp up the second half of April and then extend into the core of May. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. Matthew, I should have mentioned that in the radar, or in the briefing. These horizontal convective rolls, you could certainly see early on when the storm first developed. And notice how those were oriented more southeast to northeast. I believe that, well, that's created by low-level shear, first of all, and just a little bit of capping along into the north of that outflow boundary, and that allows for the creation of those horizontal rolls. Those are created by strong low-level shear as well. And you can see how those curve into the storm. So they're kind of oriented northwest to southeast, and as you get closer to the storm, they're more oriented east to west. Those are basically the visual representation of streamwise vorticity within the layer that they're spinning. So this this storm moved east-southeast, almost parallel to those horizontally rotating tubes in the atmosphere, and that's streamwise vorticity. So when the storm is moving parallel to those normally invisible horizontally rotating tubes, it can more easily stretch them into the vertical because the residence time is longer along those tubes, and it can very easily stretch those into the vertical. When the storm's moving perpendicular, though, to those horizontally rotating tubes, it just hops right over them, and it's less likely to ingest that vorticity that's strong enough to be turned into a tornado. Well, that was a good question. I meant to cover that. Hang in there, Kat. You'll be okay. Just try to focus on the simple things like the sky being blue, new tree buds coming out. Little things that trigger happiness within us, I think, are those simplistic things like a good tasting gas station burrito or the taste of yellow Gatorade, for example. If you have a pet, a cat or a dog or a snake, anything, whatever triggers a little bit of happiness, I think is a good thing to focus on. But every time I fired up the news, I would definitely panic and get very scared. I panic usually a couple times a day. And I think that's just normal when a 1 in 100 year pandemic happens. It's normal to be afraid. There's a lot of uncertainty ahead too. But we're all in this together, and we'll be okay in the end. I've never been to the Tiger King place. I'm on episode 2 now, but he did only live like 5 miles to the south of where I lived. I did miss the Winterwood tornado, though, the Katy tornado that he saw in the documentary. Kind of a long story as to why I missed that, but I had to get my ex up for a live hit up in Wichita, so that's why I missed the Katy tornado. No regrets. But my plan, too, is to do once I start doing this as a podcast, I want to bring in other storm chasers, too, have them FaceTime into my computer somehow. And then I can start doing chaser profiles, too, during this downtime. Start interviewing storm chasers and their plan and what motivates them to chase. I don't have the correlation coefficient data from this, but I can ask Don to get it from Radar Omega, and then I'll post it later on today. But I'm certain that there was a signal there. I'll have you on, Caleb, along with Scantman. We could do that as our first podcast. I've already asked Mike, actually. I don't talk to Chris anymore, Gina. He did some things that weren't very nice. But he was my best friend one of my best friends from high school, growing up in Michigan. And he was kind of in trouble up there in Michigan, so I said, hey, come move down on my floor. We'll start extreme tornado tours. And then storm chasers happened the next year. I was able to get him in the back seat, get him a job, and then we kept chasing for the next few years, and then bad things happened. But that's what happens. Usually friendships go south in the end, I've noticed. No matter how much you do for people. One day I'll tell you all the stories about the whole downfall, but it's probably best to keep them to myself for a little bit longer. But yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff that happened. A lot of bad things too. But still chasing. That's too bad about the tours and everything. People are not able to come here from other countries to storm chase. But there will always be more tornadoes. There'll be more tornadoes next year. Yeah, he ended up trying to steal the Dominator 1, take it to Canada, and was embedded with this crazy publicist up there that his name was on the title because we were trying to get like 2 or 3 vehicles on the Discovery contract, but we were only able to get 1, so I had to put Dominator 2 in Chris's name, which is one of the bigger mistakes in my life. In the end, it's just kind of funny what happened. It's best, though, to keep your material possessions as minimal as possible, I've noticed. So I just have a couple one pair of pants, a pair of shorts, 5 or 6 pairs of underwear, a Subaru, and that's really all you need. He tried. I got it back. I was able to get it back, but it emptied out our bank accounts, TVN bank accounts and stuff too. I'm trying to stay out of the whole chaser police thing. That's all human drama that generally makes you a little more upset with time. But it is a worthwhile discussion to have. You know, you can't have thousands of storm chasers going out there helping to spread this virus. At the same time, though, when you're storm chasing, you're very socially isolated. Very physically isolated. Especially if you work on it. I was sleeping in my car there a lot of times. I had gloves, masks, disinfectant fluid. But I've been physically distancing ever since my divorce, too. That's why I haven't been sick in 4 years. So really, not a lot had to change on my end. Yeah, Gizmo is huge. She's definitely the most important part of my life right now. Definitely part of my family here. Big fan of that dog. Dr. Josh Werman, Tom, I think you're talking about. I actually saw him at ChaserCon, believe it or not, and I decided to come up and have a conversation with him. We were actually discussing the virus, the pandemic. I told him how worried I was and how I thought it was going to blow up and the exponentials and everything, and he actually downplayed the virus. I was saying I was washing my hands and I should have been wearing a mask, and he's like, well, then you can't build up natural immunities. But that doesn't make sense because it's a brand new virus too. So he obviously doesn't understand how viruses operate. Neither do I, but I still had a very good reason to be worried about it around ChaserCon. I didn't even want to make an appearance at ChaserCon due to the virus. Oh, that's okay, Kat. I'm just thankful for the opportunity to have a chance of getting married. I have no hard feelings or no regrets. It was a great time. I was cooking a lot, so it was a good time. I'm not too worried about that, Elizabeth. I'm just dedicated 100% to storm chasing until the end of my days. But we'll keep up these daily briefings. Even during this quiet period, if you guys have any suggestions on another case study that you'd like me to focus on, I'm sorry it took me so long to do the case study on the RENO tornado. But hopefully these briefings also help you stay a little focused away from the virus. I know it can be a little bit negative sometimes. All right, guys, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your Sunday. Let's all go watch Tiger King again. And I hope you guys enjoyed this case study, and we'll keep breaking these down one after another. It all goes down to the photograph, it always seems like. But have a good rest of your Sunday, and hope you guys enjoyed this briefing. Never stop chasing.